The Constitutional Court rules against the impeachment of Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. We cover this verdict on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Press Perspective for March 25th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. The Constitutional Court has yet to rule on the impeachment of President Yoon Suk Yeol, but its verdict on the impeachment of Prime Minister Han Duck-soo from his post as acting president earlier on Monday has triggered quite a bit of speculation about the potential fate of the president. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Great to be here. Thanks.
I also have freelance journalist Raphael Rashid with us. Raphael, it's good to have you here.
Great to be back.
Right, Thomas, we'll start with you. Let's begin with details of the Constitutional Court's verdict on the impeachment of Prime Minister Han Duck-soo from his post as acting president, which was announced yesterday.
Right, so the Constitutional Court dismissed the impeachment of Han Duck-soo, and he was able to return immediately, basically, to his role as acting president. It was an expected verdict, I think, maybe a little bit more complicated in the way it played out. It was, there's 8 justices on the Constitutional Court, and the ruling 5-1 ruled to reject the impeachment basically on the merits of the case, ruling that, the various things he had been impeached for did not rise to the level of, him being removed from office. The other 2 justices just kind of threw it out entirely based on a procedural matter, which was they were saying that there should have been a 2/3 quorum in the National Assembly, which is the level needed to impeach a president, versus there was something like 192 out of 300 voted for his impeachment. And pretty much everyone other than the president only requires a majority of 151. So they were saying that he, in his role as president, he should have met that threshold. So they threw that out. And within that, the grounds, there was basically 5 charges he was facing on the impeachment motion. And a couple of them were him not appointing special prosecutor. Some was earlier on a special prosecutor to investigate the First Lady. But he was also accused of kind of conspiring or abetting Yoon in the implementation of martial law. And then he had also afterwards, there was this kind of dual leadership situation that had arisen, which he was going to kind of co-lead with the then head of the People Power Party, lead the government. They charged him over that. But the main thing really was that he refused to immediately appoint more justices to the Constitutional Court. There were only 6 at the time. It should have 9 in total on the bench. And so there were 3 proposed, and he rejected it, sort of saying that there needs to be a bipartisan consensus about that. And the reason that the opposition was anxious to get more justices seated on the court is that it takes 6 total to uphold the impeachment, and so they wanted as many as possible, not just 6. So that was basically the sort of grounds of it. And something 4 out of the 5 found that that part was unconstitutional, he didn't fulfill his constitutional duty to appoint the justices, but they felt that it did not reach the level of kind of an impeachable offense. So there was that. One justice did dissent and support that the special prosecutor and justices not appointing them was enough to warrant removal. So that was basically it. I mean, the main thing that I think people were looking for is that they really didn't make any judgment as to the illegality of the actual martial law decree in the first place, and that was something that observers were looking for. So they really didn't mention that at all. So that's more or less where we are.
Right, and before we delve into that part, Raphael, then what has been the response to the ruling with regard to the impeachment case against the PM?
Yeah, I think predictably the response has been quite heated on both sides and has triggered this partisan reactions. Given all the tensions in the political landscape at the moment, the ruling People Power Party immediately launched a fierce offensive attack against the opposition, declaring that the verdict was an iron hammer brought down by the Constitution against what they termed as the Democratic Party's legislative dictatorship, a word that they have been using for quite some time now. We have the former PPP leader Han Dong-hoon, who also demanded that the opposition leader Lee Jae-myung apologize sincerely for what he characterized as a repeated political abuse of the impeachment process. On the other side, then we have the Democratic Party that expressed, I would say, measured dissatisfaction while attempting to frame the ruling as inconsequential, essentially. We have Lee Jae-myung, who acknowledged that we must respect the court's decision, as he said, but asked whether the public could possibly accept a prime minister who deliberately violated his constitutional duty and faced no consequences. And I think that was quite telling, quite important, because, of course, the big one coming, the verdict of President Yoon, we'll need to see whether the two sides accept the verdict for what it is. Even today, now acting President Han said that whatever the outcome, we need to accept it for Yoon. And when it comes to these two political parties, they have also said to some extent that they will accept the outcome of Yoon's verdict, but have shown have suggested that the other side won't accept it. So then when we look at this ruling with Han, we have Lee Jae-myung who's saying, we accept it, but will the people accept it? So I think we can see how this might go, regardless of what side, for when we see the verdict with Yoon. But beyond the political arena, we have, of course, the pro-Yoon groups, supporters that were celebrating outside the court. I was there yesterday, and of course, with the staple, US flags and Korea flags, they were shouting, this is a victory for the Republic of Korea, and we have won. So they seem to have a lot of, I would say, optimism in the air. Conversely, the anti-Yoon groups held multiple press conferences condemning the decision, as basically one group said it was driving a nail into the hearts of citizens. Han Duck-soo, meanwhile, wasted no time in returning to his duties, official duties, especially in terms of overseeing the emergency responses to the wildfires currently spreading across the country. But I think this ruling yesterday has clearly intensified the speculation about Yoon's forthcoming impeachment verdict, with both sides now, I think, kind of recalibrating their expectations based on how the court approached Han's case.
Right. Thomas, as Raphael just mentioned, there is much speculation about the potential fate of President Yoon Suk Yeol. What have you been hearing?
A lot of different things, really. In some sense, it does have this kind of Rorschach blob quality to it, where people do seem to be, in some cases, seeing maybe what they want to see in the ruling. But I would say, probably the main takeaway I've gotten is that it doesn't really tell us much of anything. As I mentioned before, the fact that the illegality or the constitutionality of the actual martial law decree in the first place wasn't touched on in the judge's decision. That's something that doesn't really give you a sense of where they're heading. And I think many observers say that this is a considerably different case than what Yoon is facing. And so I think I would say probably, the overwhelming majority are not really trying to draw much of a conclusion from it. But at the same time, I have seen some speculation that just the fact that it took so long, just even for the Han Duck-soo ruling, and the kind of the way it's seen as a bit of a complex decision, there was some dismissal, some just outright rejection, one acceptance, gives some sense that the justices are really deliberating all of these things deeply and may not be on the same page, and especially if that applies to the Yoon case, that would lead some to speculate, the longer this drags on, maybe there will be some kind of decision to reject Yoon as well, or at least that it's a complicated, not as we've been following along. I think the sense was early on, after the trial wrapped up at the end of February, most people expected it would be a couple of weeks, pretty much based on precedent of prior impeachment decision. So the fact that it's dragged out this long, and then the Han thing maybe adds a little bit to that sense of, oh, they're really weighing this. It's not as clear cut as we thought. There's that sense. There's some, right, as Raphael mentioned too, I mean, it's certainly being used, the rejection of Han's case is being used by sort of the leaders of the People Power Party and Yoon supporters as trying, as saying that, yes, they're kind of, this is an example of pushing back against this sort of legislative violence, as one of them called, so maybe this is the way the wind is blowing in general. I mean, that may be wishful thinking. I mean, right, I think his supporters are also trying to draw some maybe solace from that or some indication. At the same time, it's obviously increasing the level of anxiety for those that are hoping to see Yoon removed and hoping to see the impeachment pass. And as the longer this draws out, I mean, there's clearly a sense of anxiousness around that. But I think, other than that, it's just some kind of a lot of speculation as to, why did they do the Han decision before Yoon, and there's some sense maybe they did that to stabilize the government ahead of bringing Han Duck-soo back into power as the president might sort of help to stabilize the government ahead of the Yoon decision. So those are, I mean, I think that's kind of where things stand now, and it's still, I don't think there's been any real clear indication that we can grab onto.
Right. Raphael, there are two possible scenarios with regard to the president's impeachment trial. Either he is reinstated back into the top office or he is removed from his post. That being said, what events do you envision if President Yoon Suk Yeol returns to the top office?
I think there's a third option. Maybe he would step down. But I think, if President Yoon were to be reinstated, I think that would definitely trigger immediate, intense public backlash. A recent poll from Gallup Korea showed that approximately 58% of Koreans supported his removal versus 36% opposing it. So I think his return to office would effectively reject the majority sentiment, and that would, I think, naturally trigger widespread demonstrations across the country, across major cities as well. In his final statement at his impeachment trial, Yoon did indicate that he might propose some constitutional amendments and delegate some significant domestic authority to the Prime Minister, focusing on foreign affairs himself. So it seems that he tried to say that he was going to kind of diffuse tensions by having some kind of political compromise, although it's not clear how that would work or what he really means. But I think there's definitely profound skepticism about whether whether or not he would actually do that, or whether it would satisfy the demands of the people. I've read that some people are saying that this was a ploy and we cannot trust him. I think the more concerning scenario is that Yoon's reinstatement could be interpreted as a validation of his emergency powers. During his impeachment trial, over and over again, or throughout all his messages to the public, he did defend martial law as his legitimate act of governance, rather than expressing any form of regret. So I think this does raise troubling questions about whether he might resort to similar measures again when facing political opposition, especially given that the Democratic Party still controls the National Assembly. Some people think it's a joke. Would he do it again, a second or third martial law? But I do think we should at least consider the possibility that could be a case.
What events do you envision if President Yoon Suk Yeol is removed from the top office then?
Well, of course, if he is removed, then South Korea would have to hold a snap election within 60 days. I've been checking when Park Geun-hye was removed. I think they gave the full amount, I think it was 59 days or 60 days essentially, for the people to be able to cast their to make their minds up in a proper way and with sufficient time. You know, the Democratic Party leader, Lee Jae-myung, is said to be a favorite, but of course he faces his own critical court ruling verdict on election law violations tomorrow, and I think that could potentially complicate his candidacy. Of course, we'll have to see whether he appeals. If he's found guilty, of course, I think he would, but will the public continue to support him in that case? But the scenario of Yoon being removed, I think, also brings risks. I think we've already witnessed concerning signs of potential violence at the Seoul Western District Courthouse in January, where protesters stormed the courthouse and were hunting for the judge who had extended Yoon's detention warrant, leaving dozens of police officers injured. And I think, you know, I don't want to talk about violence too much, but we can't forget what happened in 2017 when Park Geun-hye was removed. 4 people did tragically pass away on that day of the impeachment verdict. I think this violence or potential collisions or clashes needs to be taken seriously, and the police, not just in Seoul but across the country, are taking every measure needed. And I think you know, schools in the area will be closed, the station is going to be closed. Just today, news that police have been removing bricks and loose objects from the area near the court. So I think, you know, I don't want to think about it too much, but I think it's definitely something to consider. But regardless of the outcome, I think South Korea, you know, is facing a challenging route ahead, given the depths of polarization, regardless of the outcome of the verdict. And I don't think either verdict will bring any form of national healing anytime soon. Of course, one side will be severely dissatisfied.
Right. Meanwhile, Thomas, earlier on, we spoke about the opposition party being accused of rampant impeachments at the parliament by the ruling party. What do you suppose has been the toll of these bouts of bickering among politicians at the parliament on Korea's state affairs and on its people?
Right. Well, you know, I think on the one hand, it's a symbol of the political division, or a symptom of the political divide in the country. You know, and obviously critics would argue that it's exacerbating that political division, you know, and political sort of instability. There's been, I think the number I saw was 30 impeachment motions total during the presidency of Yoon Suk Yeol, and something around a dozen or something related to the martial law. And you know, the Constitutional Court has pretty much rejected all of them up to this point, you know, including the Han Duck-soo. There's still one that we're waiting to see. They also were talking about filing a motion against the previous acting president, Choi Sang-mok, which now I don't know that they've officially withdrawn that. I know the Democratic Party floor leader Park Chan-dae was still talking about it yesterday and sort of saying that Choi did, you know, even more impeachable things than Han Duck-soo. So it's still in the air. You know, obviously opponents are certainly utilizing this as one of their main attacks on the legitimacy even of the Yoon impeachment, and the sort of, you know, accusing the Democratic Party of sort of playing politics and, you know, trying to get an election done quickly and partly ahead of perhaps the ruling on Lee Jae-myung's viability as a candidate, you know. And so, you know, there's obviously some truth to the matter that it doesn't seem a great way to run a government to be constantly impeaching the opponents. You know, I would also argue, well, you know, Han Duck-soo, when he returned as acting president, made a statement talking about how we have to kind of get away from this extremism, find, you know, common ground. And I think no one would argue that that would be an ideal situation. But I think it's also, you know, we have to recognize that Korea and many places in the world are just existing in this kind of vastly transformed political and information space where it's really hard to kind of even find anywhere to start about, you know, discussions of common ground. We're kind of in this funhouse mirror version of information. I mean, covering the, you know, particularly sort of the pro-Yoon, anti-impeachment rallies. I mean, really,
which you covered this past weekend.
I was there this weekend, and many times. I know Raphael has obviously been there a number of times too. As these have been going on, the main thrust of most of Yoon's supporters are that this was all about election fraud. This is all about plots by North Korea and China to control the government, and you're sort of they're getting most of their information from YouTube, other sources. I mean, the level of distrust in mainstream media is quite low. I mean, to some extent on both sides, clearly. But so, even when I think, were the Democratic Party to make a sort of good faith effort somehow, it's a question of, how much would that information get across to the other side? And, when I look at sort of parallels with the US, sometimes I think the bigger criticism, even from supporters of the Democratic Party there, is you're not doing enough. You're treating kind of all of this democratic backsliding as, you're trying to treat it as something normal, or trying to use the old rules in this vastly different environment. And I think that's to some extent happening here and in other places around the world. So we're kind of in this strange space where it sounds good to talk about finding common ground. And maybe, yes, hopefully going forward, maybe after this election, there could be some ground rules set up about how much you can impeach somebody else. I mean, I'm not saying that I think this is a great way to govern, but I do think it's a complicated issue that speaks to a kind of a larger just information and political space that we find ourselves in.
Right, and this is probably why, Raphael, earlier on you mentioned how the healing process is still way off. It would take a really long time. But if you were to perhaps talk about a step in the right direction with regard to healing, with regard to bringing the two political sides together, whether we're talking about the parliament or people here in general, how does a country, do you suppose, bounce back from such political turmoil?
I mean, I think that's $1 million question.
It really is.
For not just for South Korea, but for many, many countries around the world. I think the challenges that Korea is facing are not just maybe policy or political disagreements. I think they're fundamentally about different interpretations of democratic legitimacy itself. On the one hand, you have one side that views the president's actions as legitimate and protecting democracy. The other side sees his actions as literally attacking democracy. So I think finding common grounds in this specific context is very difficult. I think it's important, as Thomas just mentioned about these kind of conspiracies going around, I think it's important that they are dispelled and that people are knowledgeable about what is real and what is not real, because I think, of course, different people have different interpretations of what truth is, but if at least the facts are on the table for people to see, hopefully it would reduce some of this animosity and really concerning depths of these conspiracies that people are falling into. When it comes to this kind of reconciliation, I think what's encouraging, perhaps, maybe I'm an optimist, is that South Korea has navigated serious political crises before, and we have seen this with after Park Geun-hye was impeached in 2017, and despite, of course, initial opposition and protests, to some extent, of course, not in a perfect way, but to some extent, the country did ultimately, I think, accept the constitutional process and then eventually transitioned peacefully to a new administration. We did see when Moon Jae-in was president that at some point, I fail to remember when, but at some point he did have really, really record high approval ratings, so clearly meaning that people who might not have voted for him, felt satisfied with what he was doing. So I think this historical precedent might suggest that the kind of institutional framework for healing does exist, and I'm hoping that that will be the case going forward, again, regardless of the verdict of this impeachment process. I think the political leadership, of course, matters tremendously. acts of principled, cross-partisan cooperation, and as Thomas mentioned, the need to find common grounds. Sometimes I wonder, is one political leader able to sit down for a meal with the other side? Is that even possible? They just treat one another as complete enemies, but that's clearly not in the best of interest for the country and the people. So, I do kind of wonder, is having a coffee together even possible? And I would probably ask them that question if and when I get to meet them. Of course, there needs to, I think, also be a structured dialogue mechanism that allows people to legitimately air their grievances on both sides. And I think many people are disillusioned, especially young people. I think they've lost a lot of hope in the way the country is run by especially older men. And I think a lot of them don't seem to feel that they are represented. So I think there needs to be a lot more forums where these shared frustrations can be addressed, and that kind of includes everyone in society. And of course, it's again, wishful thinking, but we need to see definitely a lot more women in Parliament as parliamentarians, different age groups as well. There really needs to be a lot more diversity if people want to feel that they are represented and heard. So those will be, of course, looking forward, we need to be addressing kind of the economic inequalities in society. Why are people feeling so frustrated? Why are they so angry and venting out at one side versus the other, and maybe even using these mottos of "Stop the Steal"? I don't think they even necessarily believe it or understand what it means, but I think it's a unifying motto to kind of rally people together. But clearly people are very upset and very have many grievances. So I think, we need a kind of forum to alleviate these and hopefully go forward a little bit more. But I guess overall, the current crisis has shown also the democratic resilience of the people. So, I do have a little bit of hope going forward.
Right. Raphael, hopefully after the political turmoil here in the country, the two leaders of the two opposing rival parties come together and, like you said, share a meal. Raphael, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Thomas, as always, thank you very much for your insights. Right, well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. We return tomorrow with the latest on the US's plan for reciprocal tariffs. Do join us then.